Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. Back on the show after a couple of weeks off and doing some traveling and seeing the world. And we are happy today to be, joined here in the massive Cloudcast studios and from parts of the world by a good friend of the show, longtime, well-known person in this space, moving around a little bit. John Troyer, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for that intro, Brian.
I know that was
to be here.
It was a weird introduction, but I wasn't exactly sure how to introduce you because a lot of the people I think who listen to this show know you from your days at VMware, and you very successfully ran director of community and a lot of other projects there. So I mean, you've been heavily involved in the industry that the Cloudcast grew up around, and now you're doing something called Tech Reckoning, which I'm an avid reader of and aware of. But tell folks what Tech Reckoning is and why you decided to go down that path.
Sure. Thanks. Well, I left VMware 2014, I guess, and I had done a lot of community things there, and we had a very successful community, and I saw what it could do for VMware and for people's lives and careers. So people kept asking me at vendors, hey, how could we do this? And aside from my first answer, which was get a time machine, go back to 1999 and invent a new infrastructure layer that's going to change the industry, that wasn't a very good answer. So I said, well, maybe I could help you. So I'm a little bit of a consulting arm. We're a small agency that helps with influencer marketing and that sort of thing, and that's growing. And then we're also kind of a media arm where we have a newsletter and a podcast, and I work with other people on some podcasts, some venture capitalists and other companies. And I'm working on some new stuff in development, which we maybe will get to.
Yeah.
Trying the basic thought about Tech Reckoning is, look, you've got this great bottom-up, peer-to-peer way of communicating now. And most companies don't know how to take advantage of it. And two, most professionals aren't taking advantage of it. And the professionals that do take advantage of it, that listen to podcasts like this, that go to conferences and meetups, have an advantage in their careers. So how can I help the IT industry get to wherever this IT industry is going? And that involves clouds and containers and automation and all that sort of good stuff. So I'm trying to help people and at the same time make a business about it.
Right. And I think, the thing that I've always admired that you do so well is, there's always going to be technology in this industry. There's always going to be new things coming along. There's always going to be, what's hot, technology X kills off technology Y. And you've honed in very much on the people side of this business. And I don't mean that in the sense of just being, the completely sort of soft side of this, but really trying to help people say, look, you need to have a plan, whether you're on the individual side of the world and you're trying to navigate what your career looks like, how to find good mentors and good communities to be around, or, as you're talking to, vendors and so forth, like trying to help them realize, like, technology gets sold to people. It gets consumed by people. It gets used by
Yes.
And I think what you do in that space is really interesting. And I think we're going to try and explore some of that today in a bunch of topics that you and I have been having these conversations for a bunch of weeks, just, in other mediums. And we thought we'd try and record something today.
Absolutely. And I probably should have not failed to promote the actual places you can interact with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which would be the Tech Reckoning newsletter is probably the most easy one. And that's just over at techreckoning.com. Every week or a couple weeks, I send out some notes about links and, what's going on in the industry and some commentary. And then I do also do the most active podcast I do, other podcasts other than this, is the Geek Whisperers podcast, and that's together with a couple of other folks, Amy Lewis and Matt Brender. And there we talk about geek careers, and it's mostly kind of industry careers, but also IT careers and evangelism, and again, how this stuff gets talked about and sold, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and obviously we've always been big fans of the Geek Whisperers. We've known Amy and Matt and you for a long time, and folks, it's a great show in terms of just people telling stories about how they got to wherever they were in the industry. And it's, for a lot of people, for a lot of the conversations I hear, people will go, how did you get there? Did you have a path to get there? Did you think you would get where you were? And it's I don't know if it's surprising, but you do realize that a lot of people that people view as successful didn't necessarily have this as a 20-year plan, but they've learned how to learn. They've learned how to navigate when things change overnight, and so yeah, we always highly recommend other shows, and Geek Whispers is always on my list of ones that I listen to all the time.
Thanks.
So let's. So you and I have been having this conversation for a while now, and it always sort of starts with the topic of DevOps, and it sort of goes down the path of like, what do you think it is? Or you'll ask me what I think it is, at least on any given day. And then we, once we get past sort of like, okay, that's a definition and whether it's good, it's like, well, what does this mean? Like put this into practicality for me. Give me, you've been digging into this. You've been looking at, how to see if it's applicable to people. Like, give me your, I don't know, where do you stand in the DevOps world these days?
Well, it's interesting. I think my personal theory of DevOps is that it's a reaction against Agile and all the machinery and consultancy that grew up around Agile and all the rigid rules and all the rigid, the principles, by being in part by being refusing to be defined. And so that's a little bit why everybody has a hard time putting their hands on it. On one hand, you have folks, and I've talked to folks at Pivotal and others that say, well, DevOps is around dev. And if you don't have dev in your organization, you can't do DevOps. It's around getting, time to value with software development. And that seems to be a reasonable definition of DevOps. On the other hand, if you go to a DevOps days, of which there are many these days, which is kind of amazing, right? They've really proliferated. It's a very good way of going to your local community and getting connected there. It seems to be more about culture and more about empathy and more about kind of organizational lean manufacturing, blah, 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 sort of thing. So I don't know, Brian, I have a hard time putting my hand on it. If you use the dev definition, like you have to have development, that cuts out a majority of people who call themselves sysadmins, right? Because a lot of shops don't do their own dev. And so I really struggle with that definition. Yeah,
I agree with you. I think because we've had some of the folks who sort of live in the quote unquote DevOps community on the show before. We've had, Michael Ducey from Chef, and we've had Bridget Cromholt, who, is now over at Pivotal, and, lots of other people in between. We had Chris Short last week. We did a show, or a couple weeks ago we did a show. I think you're right. I think I always sort of look at it from the perspective of, if you are actually building software. So let's just start with sort of that area, because I think it is applicable for other stuff. But let's just say you're building software. There's this natural impedance mismatch between how fast software could get written and or /tested, and then how long it takes to get it onto machines that are making it operational, right? So it's always the argument of like, hey, there's no point in infrastructure if it's not actually running out, applications. And I think what I used to see in the DevOps community was a lot of focus on ops, right? So they were always led by companies, they were sponsored by Chef or Puppet or Ansible or whatever. And there was a lot of this like, hey, you've got to automate everything. You've got to teach your sysadmin people how to use the same sort of tools that developers use, code repositories, and you want to use, CI tools like Jenkins and automate everything. And then I think you're right. I think what happened was, there was this thing where it was like, okay, I started using that stuff and things don't feel better. Like they don't inherently feel like we've sort of bridged the gap, whatever that gap was. And so, yeah, I think they sort of over-rotated back towards empathy and people-centric things and trying to be rearranging your org chart. And that's a hard thing for people, because I think you're asking geeks to do what consultants tend to do. And geeks don't typically have the patience. Geeks don't typically have the patience to want to go through a reorg. They're not getting paid to do a reorg, or they may not have the power to drive a reorg.
Right. It's also very hard to do from the bottom up, right? It has to kind of come from the top down. But also, I think the geeks have a lot to add to this whole developer-centric developers as operators and operators as developers kind of thing. Mm-hmm. The infrastructure geeks, that is. I was at a talk recently and was hearing, I think it was Rich Miller talked and also Damon Edwards talked, both about real-world scenarios of where they came in as consultants mm-hmm. to try to transform people's project and make it more agile and more DevOpsy. And both of them said it did not work until we brought in the infrastructure people, in particular the security and compliance people, and there were some other aspects as well. So I think we go back to stereotypes and generalizations about developers being a little bit cowboy and being a little bit loosey goosey with the structure, and the IT infrastructure people being a little bit a little more rigid and a little more retentive about sort of things. And I think those have an element of truth in them, and you got to bring them both together. So I think the operator people do need to learn about DevOps, and I think it's critical for them to be able to bring their skills about architecture and IOPS and security and all the successful architecture and day two operations and upgrades and all those sort of things which may not have been thought of by developers or focused on. Now, of course, the developers will now email you, Brian, and say, "Well, we've been thinking about those for years." But
well, let me put that in context, though. So and I hate to keep bringing back VMware because I know you're kind of beyond that and much, but you've moved beyond that world.
Mm-hmm.
But if you sort of put things in context, like what VMware did with virtualization was originally very server centric, right? It was the thing that touched applications the closest in terms of infrastructure. So you could spin up a VM in a few seconds or a few minutes. You could automate how to do that process. And if you looked at, you used to run, weekly calls, and you looked at message boards, and all the complaints were always about the infrastructure, right? It was networking, or it was about storage, or it was about whatever. And to a certain extent, if you look at that and you go, well, let's step back from blame and just sort of put that in context. Like the idea of making servers into software was a 2006 to 2010 thing. The idea of making networks and storage into software has really only been the last couple of years, and it's still got a ways to go in terms of kind of bringing it on par in terms of saying, like, it's kind of software, it has APIs, it could potentially start to act the way you want it to act. Do you think that's a part of it, or do you think it really is just this sort of mindset of network and storage and security teams to go like, look, my job isn't to go 1,000 miles an hour. My job should be focused on stability and availability and those things, sort of mismatch of goals.
Well, I think it's never one thing, right? It's always a confluence of the bigger picture and technology advances and things like that. We now have a surplus of infrastructure, right? We have more capacity. When the capacity was scarce and infrastructure was scarce, you needed high priests of infrastructure to allocate it and take care of it. It's now abundant. So some of that need goes away. Now we can do things like software-defined networking and software, which are perhaps, in the old world would have been too inefficient. So you've got some of that coming on. I do think as technologies grow up, they get boring. You could use the Wardley, town planners sort of analogy, or you could do other stuff. But at some point, that's why you hear rumblings. We've heard rumblings in the last 6 months. Well, Docker's moving too fast. From some of the infrastructure folks, or from some of the folks that are trying to put it into production. And so you do have to slow down. You do have to get stable, and you do have to not be on. You should not have to be on Twitter and Hacker News and GitHub at 24 hours a day to understand what the hell's going on with infrastructure.
Yeah, no, I agree. And John's a popular guy. He's getting called from the bat phone right now. I agree with that. Let me throw something out. And you and I were going to record this, I think the day after the election, and everybody was sort of in a fog the day after, so we didn't. But I have an analogy, and tell me if you think this is completely wrong.
Okay.
And I'm not going political on this thing, but it did sort of dawn on me the next morning as I was thinking about some things. And I think you and I have talked about this. Like, there is a certain conversation that happens, especially around the DevOps Day events, but you hear it throughout our industry, which is sort of infrastructure is a commodity. You don't really have to worry about that anymore. It's readily available. The actual technology is a commodity. Don't worry about it. And I get the sense sometimes that the people who do work in that space. So if you for example, you listen to any of the Packet Pushers podcasts, you listen to any of those, that like it's a crowd of people who are still incredibly passionate about what they do. They feel like they've done a lot. And I feel like to a certain extent, the DevOps kind of community ignores them in sort of the same sense that, you had a section of people within this last election who felt like they'd been ignored, and they felt like they wanted to fight back. I wonder if, you get that sense that, downplaying the infrastructure people isn't really helping the DevOps community that much, because there's still people that have to, like you said, make this stuff work. Do you buy into that at all? Like that we have to, you can't completely just ignore that and say it's a commodity?
Make infrastructure great again.
No, I don't want to go down that path. But do you ever get that sense where it's like, you're sort of, there's a crowd of people that sort of talk down to who that audience is?
Oh, 100%. Infrastructure is always at the bottom, in metaphorically and architecturally, and status-wise. If you looked around 5 years ago, you would have a lot of people that were saying the public cloud was going to take over everything. In fact, you still do, right?
Sure.
I can get on that fight on Twitter today. But I think we're starting to realize as an industry, as a multi-trillion-dollar industry, that you're going to have a lot of different things going on at once. It's never going to be all of one thing. And you're going to get, I think that the term of art today is hybrid cloud, right?
Sure.
You have that we're understanding that IT departments are no longer masters of just their data center, which is probably a closet somewhere, near the bathroom. They are masters of a wide variety of services, some of which live off-site, some of which live in the public cloud, some of which live in colos, and some of which in many different places, very diverse. If you have that kind of environment that is multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, then you are still going to have infrastructure. You're still going to have to care about infrastructure. And I think more and more we're realizing that, and I think more and more that's where we're starting to see a little bit of separation of concerns and a little bit more of understanding. Yes, if you're all going to Amazon, you still need that kind of app ops and kind of cluster ops and that sort of management, but you don't need the infrastructure ops because the secret underground dwellers at AWS will take care of all that, and there's very few of them, and they take care of many machines. But if you actually do have some clusters on site that you have to manage, you're going to have to start to keep managing infrastructure. And certainly folks like Dell EMC and HPE and others are counting on that. And it seems to be realistic too, because we can't just lift and shift everything. There's just no point, and it doesn't really work. So we're going to be living with that for decades. And so, maybe we'll be all in the public cloud, when we get to Jetsons flying cars, but we're not there yet. So I do think that infrastructure still matters. And I think we're starting to see that by the rise of people caring about things like Kubernetes. And we were just where we were going to record last week was at KubeCon.
Right.
And I think Kubernetes as an orchestrator, one of the drivers of it, and also Docker, frankly, and also Mesos and Mesosphere and DCOS is that, and the HashiCorp stuff and everything is that a recognition that, wait a minute, we need a layer that is cloud-like and DevOps-like and Agile-like, but still can be deployed in multiple places. And that might be on IBM SoftLayer, that might be at Amazon, that might be at home, with sitting right beside my VMware stuff. And so I think we're getting to this multi-cloud world, and this middle layer, I've heard it referred to as cluster ops. I don't know if that's going to end up being a term. Becomes more and more important because that's the layer that's going to be between the infrastructure and the app.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm curious. I've been kind of living around the Kubernetes community probably for about a year now. You're kind of wading into it. I know you did a lot of work around the Mesos community for a little while. I'm curious, kind of on two fronts. Your take on KubeCon, and then just your take on a different community. This open source centric. What is the Kubernetes community? What are your initial thoughts from the last couple of days that you were out there?
It seemed pretty exciting, right? There were over 1,000 people there. Kubernetes seems to have a lot of momentum. I think there's some structural reasons for that, with Google as the originator and not having to make money on it. There were a fair number of vendors there. They were all headed in the same direction. So it looks like everybody identified some similar gaps in terms of manageability and that sort of thing to sit on top of Kubernetes. It's interesting for me because I am not from an open source world, right? I'm more from an operations world, more from a proprietary vendor world. And so being a community guy, I see things through the lens of community. And so it was very interesting to see a mix of users and vendors, but mostly contributors, and how those lines blur in the open source world. Open source projects talk a lot about their community, and it took me a while, I think, to realize that their community is really a community of contributors, which, there's a little bit of a challenge there that there's also a community of users. And in the old vendor world, proprietary vendor world, right, the users are like little baby birds, and the mama bird has to feed them all, and they're not very self-sufficient. So you count on the vendor for all your fixes and all your training and things like that. Things have started to change, to mix metaphors a little bit, with the internet and with social media and with the cloud, and being able to demo stuff, and not being able to you have a time to value of much lower. But in the open source community, it's very interesting that you're very focused still on the contributors and on the large customers that are able to be contributors. And I think a vendor-centric ecosystem like Docker has more of an ability to onboard and make things easier for users, and a multi-vendor community like Kubernetes has a higher level of challenges. And I think you saw the same thing with OpenStack.
Yeah, there was some parallels to OpenStack. I know when I was sitting there, I think on the first day keynote, I forget who was giving the talk. It was either Dan Kahn, who runs the CNCF, or maybe somebody from Google. But they were talking about all these SIGs, right? These special interest groups, and the groups that focus on certain aspects of what's going on. Multi-site clustering, security, whatever, networking. And I think somebody behind me, they put up a slide, and it showed like 15 or 18 different SIGs were associated with Kubernetes. And the person behind me sort of went like, OpenStack. It's like OpenStack. And I think you're right. I think, we tend to draw parallels to things we've seen before and so forth. And, for me, there was an aspect of it where, I was in the hallways, and it was, densely crowded and packed. And I went, wow, this felt like DockerCon 2 years ago, where it was, just in a place that was overwhelmed by the number of people that were there. And that was good. And, but at the same time, there were a ton of vendors there. And if you don't sort of live in the world, you go, boy, it feels like a lot of these vendors sort of are doing the same thing. And I'm not sure how, all of them survive, and kind of the way we were when we saw, 8, 10, 12 different, distros of OpenStack. And, but I think you hit on one thing that is very different between these. And that is, OpenStack always had this sort of white elephant in the room, which is, one of the companies, kind of trying to drive this, or one or two of the companies, has this, very distinct commercial agenda that they're trying to push through this. And they're trying to, and they have to navigate, 25 other companies who don't necessarily want to see that agenda succeed. And I don't know that we see that as much, like sort of from a Google perspective in the Kubernetes community, right? I think Google wants to succeed, but they're not driving the technology in the same way that maybe we saw with, some of the companies that were doing it in the OpenStack world. Like I feel like they learned some things from there. But
I think they still certainly want to sell a lot of Google GCE and GKE and things like that. But it's a little bit different. Google, it being Google, right? They're a little bit of an outlier. I do also think, in talking to CNCF folks at the show, that they were very conscious of the OpenStack comparison, and they do not want to go down some of those same paths with some of the same politics. I mean, OpenStack, though, is a very different thing, right? OpenStack does have users in the community, but they have very large users, right? Because to really run OpenStack, you want to be a service provider or a large enterprise, right? Because it's still a little bit of rocket science even now. Or you want to get a distro from a vendor, right? Right. So, but the contributors are the larger users, and it really always was designed for that. In its DNA. Kubernetes feels a little bit different. In that it could really become a deployment layer for everybody that is cloud and destination independent. It could become this sort of a platform Lego sort of building block. And so I think you see, and that kind of bleeds in from the Docker, I think side of the world. And so I think you see the need. One of the challenges there is you have a lot of people using Kubernetes who don't know, who are not very sophisticated. And so they go to Stack Overflow and they ask, I'm trying to get my thing up on GKE and it doesn't work. I'm trying to do that, blah, blah, blah. So I think there's a higher bar there. There's a pool of users, more unsophisticated users who are not at, a big bank in New York, that you're going to have to, for it to really become what it could be. They're going to have to work with. I'm a little biased because I'd like to work in that area because I'm a community guy. So,
right.
But that's my, I see my leg. I see the world from my eyes. What can I say?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think, one of the conversations I had with some people was as you talk to users and customers, if you will, or whatever, and you start asking them well, what are you doing with it? What kind of applications do you run on it and so forth? And I think there was a certain amount of this expectation because it started in Google and, it's under this thing called the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And so there's this kind of inherent, hey, they're cloud native apps. That's what you do. And it was interesting to listen to, a lot of the people who, represented themselves as sort of end users, but they were talking about what they did. Their breadth of applications they run on Kubernetes is pretty broad. And the vast majority of them don't tend to always be sort of, brand new greenfield cloud native things. And I think there's a certain amount of that lends itself towards, why you go to these events and you when you went to the original OpenStack events, it was always where are the users? Where are the, where are the users? These, it's everybody's sort of a vendor and everybody's, whereas this was, it felt like there was a lot of users. There was a lot of sort of do-it-yourself users. I think that was the biggest community of people who just said, look, we just went and got the code and we made it work. And, we threw some Docker containers at it and they just started working and that was all good. And so I think we're seeing a different starting point in that, it doesn't necessarily, it hasn't restricted a bunch of use cases that maybe OpenStack sort of did originally when it it only supported compute and object storage. So you could only do certain kinds of applications in that space or whatever it was.
Although people really wanted OpenStack to be a VMware replacement, right?
Yeah, yeah. They did. And the OpenStack community was like, no, we will, they were always very divided. They were very some of us want to kill VMware and some of us want to kill AWS. And
that which made product management and product direction kind of challenging over the years.
Right. Whereas Kubernetes seems to have figured out some in-between thing. Now we'll see where that goes because it's hard to do a lot of things, but
I want to pull out two things from what you just said,
absolutely.
Actually, very different things. One of which was the stateful stuff, right? The stateful sets, formerly known as pet sets talk, was completely overbooked. The one that I saw, standing room only, super crowded, could have been in the main room. So I think there's a huge amount of interest in putting stateful apps up in there. I made some joke tweet about, us old school barbarians are coming to sully your beautiful 12-factor apps with stateful services. So I think that's actually going to be super interesting. I think the networking and storage components of any container or oriented system are still to be worked out. In real production. Real solid production mode. But I think a lot of people are working on it, so that's cool. We're just going to have to reinvent everything we had with VMware and everything that Cloud Foundry has already done. But beside that, it will get there. But the other thing is interesting, the do-it-yourselfers, right? What I was getting at is the normal sequence of events with open source is you had the set of contributors, and then you had a set of vendors that would service the regular users and could support them and be that sort of in-between layer that both educated the users, gave them certifications, gave them training, gave them support, and also took their requests and fed it back into the project, right? When you have a lot of individual users who wanted to interact directly with the open source project, that becomes, that changes the dynamics. And that, I think, will be interesting in 2017 and beyond, how open source communities and how the open source foundations like Apache and the Linux Foundation work with that. Yeah, no, I agree. It was, because I know the cloud computing or the CNCF did announce
they announced not only like a certification for, what did they call it? Like managed Kubernetes service providers. So like they weren't even like managed cloud providers. They were, Kubernetes specific. And then they also announced a whole slew of training. And that to a certain extent, that does sort of disrupt the supply chain of where you go to get stuff, because it's, you're kind of catering to the do-it-yourselfers. You're also, you're kind of building a foundation of stuff that other people could, in theory, take and kind of commercialize and so forth. So yeah, that part is very different.
But there's a huge support burden, right? You've worked at vendors. You've been working at vendors.
Yeah.
There's a huge set of people whose whole job is to go out in the world and both explain what's going on, train people on it, and then take their support requests when things go wrong, right? And that's a huge headcount sort of thing that I don't know that an open source project can do with volunteers, nor can they do it from a foundation basis.
No, it is very hard. It does sort of base itself on the principle of things like, you're going to have these sort of massively, what do they call them, MOOCs, massively online, that kind of learning and training, and that may or may not work. I don't think we're far enough into that thing to see. The other thing that was interesting to me, without getting into sort of all the interesting technology nuances, I'm recording another podcast about some of those later this week. It was interesting to watch, and we see this at a lot of these open source events. Like somebody would get on stage, they would say, "Hey, I'm from such and such a company," and we'll call it like an end user company, and we do this and blah 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 blah, and here's our stuff on GitHub. And what was always interesting to me is, you were kind of listening to them, and you went, okay, they're definitely a do-it-yourselfer. Somebody would ask a question like, "Hey, why don't you use whatever that's native in Kubernetes?" And they would kind of go, "Well, it didn't exactly fit what we wanted, and so we built our own." And you go, okay, they're going to reach a crossroads where they've got to determine if they want to, keep managing it themselves, or, that team is going to do it. And what was kind of interesting to me, when I put my day job hat on and I was standing in like the Red Hat booth, is people from that same company who would say, "Well, I'm in a different group or something. We don't want to be in that space. Like we don't want, So I think we're going to see. I think companies are going to go through a crossroads of, a little bit of this, we've got part of us that, want to be a Simon Wardley pioneer. And you've got other parts of the group who are saying, no, I'm more of a town planner, like I'm that, or what, pioneers.
Well,
I'm more of a settler, I need to normalize this.
Is the core business of your business to be writing orchestration frameworks and utilities around them?
Yeah, and the reality might be like you probably should have a little bit of both, right? Like you should have groups, and what's always interesting to me is to see how many of those kind of companies do that as just sort of a, hey, this is our bleeding edge group, like they're kind of figuring stuff out, and how many of those sort of have a formal group of that called like centers of excellence, because I tend to find the centers of excellence ones never want to come out of being the centers of excellence. They're sort of like, they're like universities. They're like, hey, we like being over here. Just give us our funding and we'll, the real world, that's no fun. It has to do stateful things or whatever it is. Yeah. Cool.
That's challenging. But in the meantime, right, Microsoft is chugging along, right? And I think if the Linux-oriented, container-oriented world does not grow up and become mature through vendors or whatever, and give a full set of functionality, it's just going to be easier to put stuff on Azure, right? And I don't think Kubernetes is so young and Docker is so young. I don't think people realize the decades-long scale at which the rest of the world moves. And I don't know. That's kind of a down way to end this podcast. But I think if we don't get our stuff together in terms of usability and in terms of power and stability, the enterprise big boys will just take what they want and leave the startups in the dust.
Yeah. Well, but I think you do bring up an interesting point, right? So, if you go to any open event, for the most part, it's a Linux world, right? You sort of accept the Linux world. But if you go back to your previous world, the VMware world was kind of fundamentally a lot of Windows people. I mean, that's what they knew. And even when VMware kind of introduced some Linux centric tooling, it was like, I don't know what to do. Like this thing doesn't look like what I'm used to. I think people have to be, again, sort of careful not to totally downplay the role that people with Linux skills might still have in this. And, obviously we saw Microsoft made some announcements at KubeCon and people talking about, the beginning of Windows stuff in containers. And, and
they are spanking their people hard, right? Nano server and PowerShell. This is not a world of wizards and clicky anymore. And the admins, the old school admins, are screaming. But hey, they got to come up into the new world too. I did a great interview years ago with Jeffrey Snover, and he was like, "Look, there are lots of jobs where you don't have to keep learning, right? Go build houses or dig ditches, right? But if you're going to be in tech and IT of any sort, even at your local law firm or school, you're going to have to keep learning stuff. So, like, I'm sorry that you had a decade of wizards and clicky, but he didn't say clicky. But you're going to have to learn PowerShell, and you're going to have to learn Nano Server, and you're going to have to be much more API and CLI and script and automation oriented. So, I mean, the Windows world is coming along.
Yeah. Let me ask you one last question before we go. You like you said, you're sort of a communities person. You look at things from the lens of that. What's your 1 minute take on kind of a lot of these new tool things, GitHub, Slack, Stack Overflow, which are very, they're interactive but not people centric. And then what's your typical advice to people, whether it's an end person or a company, about how deep you want to get involved with that from a community perspective versus a different way?
Nah, the tools are a mess. I mean, but if you talk to somebody old enough, they'll tell you everything was originally invented at Vax Notes or Deck Notes anyway. So everything we've done ever since, and Usenet. I was an old Usenet person, but I think the tools are crappy. They're always crappy. But I do think the current crop of tools, Slack, is terrible for a community. It's great for chat and getting your questions answered, but it's terrible for a knowledge base, or troubleshooting, or Googling for something that's going to solve your problems, what we used to call in the vendor world call deflection. So I'm frustrated with Stack Overflow. I see a lot of corners of that are neglected, and the culture there is pretty rigid. I'm frustrated with Slack. GitHub is great, but it's not GitHub issues are not meant to be community discussions, and which they're really often used for. So this developer-centric set of communities, I think the tools are very impoverished. I'd love to see a return of forums, frankly, because I thought they were a lot more useful for actually doing technical stuff, and in fact, even more useful than there's mailing lists, but they're kind of isomorphous. So I don't know. I don't love the existing tools. That was my 1 minute. My next advice, I guess, is get involved as much as you can and then do what you can. I mean, the vendors want to work with you. The foundations want to work with you. The projects are very open to people jumping in. As individuals, the opportunities are amazing. And lots of people welcoming. I mean, you got to kind of go slow and learn the territory. As companies, that's a little more tricky, right? Because there's always business relationships in there. But I think the tools are crap, but people still manage to connect because we're social animals. So, you live with, I hate Slack, but I'm in a bunch of Slack teams. So there you go.
That's right. It's replaced your email. It wasn't supposed to replace email, but it's replaced it and augmented it.
It's just so hard to find anything. I can't find anything old. So, I mean, that's really the institutional knowledge that's being lost is really kind of frustrating to me. But I'll get over it. I'm cranky. Get off my lawn.
Well, listen, John, thank you for this. We probably could go on for quite a while, but we'll kind of wrap it up there. One last time, where can people find either your Tech Reckoning stuff or your Geek Whisperer stuff, or even just, you tend to go out to a bunch of these events that are community related. Where might you be out in the big bad world these days?
Sure. Folks can stalk me online at jtroyer, JTROYER on Twitter. That's usually where I hang out. You can go over to techreckoning.com, sign up for the mailing list. Geek-whispers.com is that podcast. And we're working on some more media stuff. I love podcasts. I'd like them to be able to more easily be able to be found. I love the newsletters these days. There's a lot of ways of curating and cutting through the noise. I think that's the biggest need these days for most people at this point in 2016, almost 2017.
Yeah, very cool. Well, folks, all of John's stuff is highly recommended by both Aaron and I. If you are just looking for ways to better understand the community, better understand how to keep up with all this stuff, how to get your stuff out into a world with people that actually care about it as opposed to noise, I highly recommend all of it. So John, thanks again for being on. And for John and for Aaron, folks, we're going to wrap it up for this week, and we will talk to you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.